Hey, good evening. Brock has joined.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How's everybody there?
Can you hear us all right?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, it
And Eric is here as well. Test my mic. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right, so this is a work session. What we are going to be doing is hearing from Brock and Eric both on where we are for our financial, put together a 5-year thing for us to look at the financials, what that might look like in a 5-year scenario. Brock will be going first, I assume. And then from there, Eric, will be listening to you on options for whether it's bonding, referendums, some options as we go forward once we identify needs and stuff for the school for more of a long-term capacity than short-term. Mr. Ron, anything you'd like to add to this?
No, I sent you the full documents. There's a lot of information there, and we probably will be looking at it. We'll also use it when we report to state agencies and share that information with them. But I think we should go ahead and get started, and I think Brock's prepared to show us some of the parts of the 5-year plan and just review what some of the assumptions were.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ronk. I'm not able to share my screen. Anybody have the capability that would allow me to?
We can try.
Well, we'll figure out if not. The prompt that comes up is host disabled participant screen sharing.
If I make you the host, can you share?
That works for me. It's a lot of power you gave me. So for those of you, oh, I'm sorry.
The host was the first thing I found, so I went with it.
All right, sounds good. All right, appreciate it. Well, good evening. As Mr. Ronk mentioned, I'm Brock Bauscher with firm Baker Tilly, formerly Umball. We have served as financial advisor to the school corporation for a number of years now, so appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am here with 4 kids and 2 dogs, so a preemptive sorry and apology for any background noise. That's why I'm wearing the headset. So for this first part, I have 2 presentations to share with your team tonight. The first one is the comprehensive financial projections, or that 5-year projection that we have discussed. And we'll walk through, as you mentioned, the heart of that presentation and summarize of where we think Delphi Schools is headed directionally, financially. Then the second part is looking at a couple of illustrative options as your team contemplates next steps for possible construction projects, some illustrations on how we could fit in debt to the outstanding debt as of today and keep those payments level without impacting the tax rates to taxpayers. Then we'll finish that part up with one slide, look at some tax rate impacts to taxpayers if the school corporation were to consider a referendum in future years. So to get started for this evening, as we conducted the comprehensive financial projections, state agencies have a lot of needs, and with continual conversations, just to remind the team, the reason why we conducted that 5-year projection is we wanted to analyze some of the impact or possible impact on state and county revenues related to the pandemic, and assess where we think we are headed directionally, and based upon some of our modeling, how we could approach those needs in future years. Then lastly, one of the main drivers for compiling the CFP is some considerations whether the school district may want to consider any type of cash reserve or cash management policy going forward to direct the superintendent and the treasurer on how to manage dollars in the future. So some general comments on the assumptions. So this presentation is 28 slides total. I'm going to spend most of my time on just a handful of these, but I'm working with Mr. Ronk. Some of the targets we developed are for Indiana schools, the drivers are essentially based upon enrollment and taxable values and cash reserves. So from an enrollment standpoint, we kept the enrollment projections fairly level with some slight drops in future years. So enrollment remaining level. Net assessed value, we work with a group called Policy Analytics, and based upon their projections, that is a parcel by parcel projection. We're actually anticipating some net assessed value increases in the coming years, which helps us manage the total tax rate, which we'll look at in a few slides. But I think the most prominent thing you'll see is the dramatic turnaround we've had in just a year for Delphi schools, where we've been able to actually build up cash balances, which has, as I think as this team knows as well as anybody, stabilized the district's finances for the short term, but then really helps project ahead on long term for the next 4 years to maintain a strong level of reserves, which then will help with our rating for the second part of discussion tonight on the construction end. So going forward, we'll continue to look at this on an as-needed basis for your district. The growing cash balances have necessitated or avoided the necessitate to review this annually because you've built those strong balances in just a year. So looking ahead on how we plan to manage our cash could be a future discussion whether we want to adopt a cash management or reserve policy to maintain a certain percentage of reserves for the school corporation. So for example, what I mean along those lines is the state of Indiana likes to keep a month and a half reserves on their books, or 12%. So those targets help the administration develop cash flow needs and targets long term, so we don't end up unintentionally in a position where we have negative cash balances in any given year. So it helps create targets for the school district to meet if policies would be of interest in the future. Then we'll look at some capital improvement options as early as 2022 and look at some options for making those investments in capital needs going forward. So here is a chart on slide 6 that has the actual average daily membership, or ADM, or enrollment, from 2008-2009 school year to the projected 2024 and 2025. So back in 2008-2009, we were at 1,582 students. And for the 2020-2021 school year, 1,400, and we just kept that level going forward. So you can see a slight dip in the trend, however, fairly level for the duration of our projections. So because of that, I think this team knows well, enrollment is a driver for state revenue and the education fund. So with this fairly level or stable enrollment through the duration of our projections, we're very reliant on our per pupil revenue from the state of Indiana. So in combination of a slight dip in enrollment, but fairly stable, and as the onset of these projections, looking at and presuming that COVID could hit us on a per pupil revenue standpoint, we projected a 3% reduction in per pupil funding. Now, that may be conservative based upon where we initially thought we were going to be as on the onset of these projections. But even with that conservative approach of 3% reduction per year, you'll see that there is still a positive trend for the education fund in the coming years for Delphi schools. This next chart is a snapshot of the 2010 through 2021 total tax rate for Delphi schools. And you can see during that time, we've ranged from about an 85-cent tax rate to $1.28. Our 2021 tax rate is about $1.01. And based upon what we're seeing in the district in combination of net assessed value growth and with managing our debt service at a fairly level standpoint, we're projecting that will be around $1 to $1.01 through 2024. And we'll look at our net assessed value in a little more detail here in just a moment. So I think maintaining a fairly level debt or total tax rate helps manage the circuit breaker, which this district and team may be familiar with, but essentially a circuit breaker is a limit to or a cap on what property owners can pay based upon the type of property. So residential property taxpayers pay no more than 1% of their gross assessed value or market value. Agricultural land pays no more than 2%, and commercial and industrial pay 3%. That's an important piece of the characteristics of our net assessed value, which we'll look at here in a little more detail. But again, assuming we'll manage a level tax rate in the coming years, helps manage that circuit breaker, which is uncollected revenue for the school district. This next chart is that net assessed value growth that you just heard me mention. So 2009 through 2021, which is now certified, we've had a little bit of up and down during that time period. So generally the trend has been up, but we've had individual years like in 2016 and 2019 and back to 2011 where we've had some negative growth. And I think as we try to project ahead from 2022 and beyond, two things really going to push where we anticipate we're going to be in the coming years. We try to use the only data we have available based upon the current tax structure from the prior recession of what happened during the Great Recession, try to project ahead. Though they're not exactly the same type of market or economic impact, you can see looking back from 2010 to about 2014 or 2015, there was only 1 year of a decrease in net assessed value. So looking back on how Delphi came out of the last recession was fairly strong because of that growth during that time period. So as we try to project ahead from 2022 to 2024, we're expecting some type of increases as well. So what you'll see in the next slide is what percentage of taxable property is ag land in Delphi. And what we've seen from 2016 to 2021 are fairly steep drops in net assessed value for ag land. And then from 2022 and beyond, it's supposed to level off, which helps us maintain some level of growth going forward. So here is a snapshot of, based upon the net assessed value, the property types within Delphi schools and where we expect those trends to be from 2021 to 2024. So this green line here, it represents the residential property within Delphi schools. And you can see this is based upon this chart, 2020. Since 2021 tax bills are not yet available, the 2020 abstract amount is what these projections are based upon. So we're projecting that residential property will continue to trend upwards in Delphi. Similarly, expecting a similar trend for commercial and industrial through that same time period. So really, the growth in the coming years is perpetuated based upon the assumption that residential property and commercial industrial property will continue to grow as it has in recent years. you heard me talk about for farmland, that drop that we talked about through 2021, but from 2022 and beyond, we're looking at it remaining fairly stable. So even though it's leveled off and we're not expecting any decrease, it's still not to the level we were back in 2019. But the good news is the ag land projection, because it forms a decent percentage of our net assessed value, that we're not going to continue to see that downward decline that we've seen since 2016. So 2022 and beyond, a leveling off of ag land. Then you'll see this last one is the non-farmland 2%. That is represented by rental property and long-term care facilities. So this too will remain fairly level going forward. So going back one slide, you can see a projection on net assessed value from 2022 through 2024. Really, the backbone of that growth is based upon residential and commercial and industrial property going forward. So if these trends hold true, Delphi schools will experience some continued net assessed value growth, which is a good thing to help with the circuit breaker, like I mentioned. Two quick charts, the kind of a side-by-side comparison is, this is a breakdown of market value property in Delphi schools. And you can see that just based upon gross assessed value or market value, that GAV1, or residential property, is the greatest portion of your gross assessed value. The second largest is that GAV3, or commercial and industrial. So almost 3/4 of just your gross assessed value is made up of those two property types that are expecting increases in the coming years of commercial, industrial, and residential. Now, I want to remind this group that gross assessed value does not equal taxable value. And we'll show that on the next slide. So for those of you who may own farmland or know somebody owns farmland, the gross assessed value of farmland is represented by 17% of the district. Then rental property or long-term care is about 10%. So again, these are the market values, not the taxable values. Now plugging in the actual net assessed value. So you saw that home values or residential property made up 40% of the market value. Once you factor in homestead credits and mortgage deductions or veteran deductions, you can see it goes from 40% to now residential property, reflecting that it is about different color, 16% of the taxable property value. So 40% to 16 on residential. Whereas NAV3 is 38%. So commercial and industrial went from 33%, and now because those entities typically don't receive a similar type of credits and deductions as residential property payers, now commercial and industrial are a much larger portion of the taxable property value. Now farmland then jumps to 21% or 1/5 of the property tax land. Non-farmland, the long-term care and rental property goes from 10% to 12%. This last portion, that is represented by the commercial and industrial. In the prior section, there is a financing option called tax increment finance, and this part of net AV is non-taxable for the traditional funds for schools. So currently this almost 76 million is non-taxable for the debt service fund or the operations fund. That portion is taxable, that if the school corporation decided to pursue an operating or capital referendum, that becomes a taxable part of the property for that fund, which we'll get into a little bit later. So now just hitting on some pretty high level trends for the education fund, and I'll go through these fairly quickly to stop at the end on the total amounts. The 2019 to 2020 actual results for the education fund. So the blue is the annual revenue, while the red is the annual expenditures for the education fund. So you can see the substantial increase in surplus when you compare 2019 to 2020. So we ended 2020 with a cash balance of approximately $1.75 million. This green line is represented by what we would suggest as maintaining at least 2 months of reserves in this fund going forward. So you can compare 2019 when we were well below 15%, but when we ended 2020, we were well above that 15% recommendation. Now, as we project ahead based upon the enrollment that you saw and the expenditures that we project ahead based upon some targets we want to maintain for the education fund going forward. And you can see that our cash balance is expected to continue to increase because we're expecting budget surpluses through 2024. Ultimately will be around 30% cash balance when you compare 2024's ending cash to 2020. So positive trend in the education fund despite stable enrollment and 3% drop expected in per pupil funding. So again, headed in a much stronger position financially. I added some commentary that I won't go through, but certainly welcome to review that and ask questions at a later date. Now the operations fund. The operations fund is a fund that is funded by local property taxes, but also receives some support from the education fund via a max transfer of 15%. So similarly to what you saw in the education fund, a positive direction for the operations fund going forward, as we're expecting budget surpluses, except a tiny deficit in 2023, but we ended with about $15,000 in the bank in the ops fund in 2019, but grew that substantially to over $1.3 million in 2020, and expect a continued strong trend through 2024 based upon our assumptions, and well above the 15% recommended. I'm doing a flyover on these, so please, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to jump in. Rainy day fund. So rainy day fund, probably not surprisingly to most here, is essentially a savings account. So we are projecting that the district will maintain, based upon some assumed transfers, a rainy day fund of about $566,000 at the end of 2024. So again, growing that cash reserve to help with our rating process in the future, to know that there is a plan to put dollars away into the equivalent of a savings account or savings fund going forward. If you look at all funds combined, which are the education fund, operations, and rainy day fund, you can see from 2017 where we were on an annual basis, which is represented by the blue, that we had budget deficits in 2017, 2018, and 2019. But in 2020, you can see the substantial amount of budget reductions where we grew back our balances to almost $4 million and expect to continue on that trend through 2024. So again, the blue line represents our December 31st budget year ending cash balance in between the education fund, rainy day fund, and operations fund. And the green line is that 2-month recommended 15% balance. So you can see your team was able to grow its cash balance substantially in 2020 while maintaining stable enrollment, a growing net assessed value, and a fairly stable tax rate from 2022 to 2024. We're expecting that trend to continue, where your team will add dollars into its reserves to stabilize the district. So in preparation for any unforeseen impact to revenue, and again in the future, your team will be well prepared to respond to it at that time. Excuse me. There are some additional supplemental schedules here in the back where you can see the enrollment that we assume, also the per pupil funding. So again, we assumed that the per pupil funding would decrease by approximately 3%, going from almost $6,200 per pupil down to $6,000 flat, and what that entails to total state aid going forward. So these are all supplemental information that I don't plan to go through. I know I hit it at the high level, but welcome any questions or comments from the team. Okay. So with that, again, just want to highlight that completely changed direction in 2020, where we position ourselves to better advocate for a better rating for future bond issues. So applaud the efforts of the district to now end well above 15%, which is the recommended balance, not only by our firm, but a group we call the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association. So you can imagine a pretty fun bunch. But maintain at least 2 months of reserves, which, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the state of Indiana, they target 12% for their own. So well within the industry standard and the allowance what the state of Indiana maintains for themselves.
Brock, I do have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
And I get the recommended. Is there a sweet spot where you guys like to see schools that are in good shape on those cash balances?
Yeah,
Is there a point where you're getting too much cash balances?
That's a really, really good question. So we and we have a similar clients, and though you want to maintain at least 15%, we don't want to have the same. You want to give yourself that flexibility that if there's a revenue reduction from the state of Indiana or property tax collections don't come in, you don't want to have something in place where that means you automatically have to start making budget reductions. So for times like that, we want to build in a policy. Typically, I work with school districts who want to maintain somewhere between 1 to 3 months in reserves, because sometimes collections come in stronger than projected, or it's vice versa, they don't come in as strong. So a lot of districts we work with try to target 8 to 25% or 1 to 3 months of reserves, knowing that the ebbs and flows of finance can come and go, but some of these things are just out of your control. So if you dip below 15%, you don't want to say, well, we're going to start making budget reductions immediately. That's why you want to give yourself a range that you give kind of a floor and a ceiling to what you want to maintain. That way, if collections come in stronger from the state of Indiana, or in this case, per pupil funding increases, there might be a ceiling amount where you're trying to get those dollars back to teachers or staff, or a tax rate decrease to the community. Eric, welcome your thoughts as well.
I could not have said it any better on that front, Brock.
more before you're done, actually, with your presentation?
I'm gonna jump to the illustrative finance options if there are no questions on the CFP.
Okay, that's what I wanted to make sure here. If anybody else has any questions on what's been presented now, Brock, that'd be a good time to do that. What it made me think of, Brock, you talked about our assessed values going up over the next, basically, 2022, 2023, 2024. It shows about a 6.17%. And we're saying that's going to come from our housing and our commercial line is what I assume the values will be coming from, since ag is stable on farm ground right now. Not much stick up and not much stick down at this point, we hope. So do you see the values coming from, like, within the housing because of increased value of current houses, or are you looking at new ones being built that may drive that up? How do you foresee that? And then on our commercial side, is tax abatement, stuff like that, how does that affect that commercial if they're coming off, or how are you evaluating that?
Yeah, two really good questions. So I'll answer the first one about the residential property. It's really hard to predict the ebbs and flows of residential property. So in the state of Indiana, property taxes are essentially 2 years in arrear. So by that, I mean, as you look at our projected 2022 net assessed value projection, it incorporates what's called trending value. So trending takes in, it's a metric developed by county assessors where they are determining essentially the percentage growth of certain property types based upon like property sales. So if average homes in a certain neighborhood are trending up by 2%, when it's not a direct assessment year, they'll establish that trending metric, and that 2% example would be 1.02. So to answer your question is, this projection is based upon the trending factor we've seen in recent years in the county and Delphi schools. So since it's hard to predict when exactly a new property will be developed from farmland to home value, we typically try to leave that out because based upon a number of circumstances, you won't know exactly when that property will finally be completed and assessed at a homestead value. So it's based upon existing property for residential projections. What'll be interesting in 2022 and beyond, back to that point about 2 years in arrear, is 2022 will be the first year that 2020 data resulting from COVID will be measured as part of that trending analysis. So what we've seen around the state, at least what I've heard anecdotally, is that residential properties have been pretty hot because the demand has been higher than the supply. So we'll see if that is the case in Delphi, as again, what I've heard anecdotally, and we won't know until late summer, where we've seen some of the initial figures from the county for 2022. On the second question, well, I'm sorry, let me make certain, did I answer your first question?
Yes, that's yeah. Basically, it's based off current in-place housing, marketing.
Yep, exactly.
Whatever it's worth, right, or projected for.
Yep, exactly. Yep, that is estimated trending factor going forward. You're exactly right. Then on the commercial industrial part is for abatements when they're known and there is a clear abatement schedule for when full assessed value will be taken in. So for example, if it's a 5 or 10 year abatement and that is housed in the database that Policy Analytics receives, that is added to the database. So it does factor in abatements that are expected to fall off in the coming years.
Brock, I have a question. Chris Nipple. On this chart on page 20, can you explain how there's such a difference in the 2020 comparison of the actual? I mean, looking at the whole chart, it looks like most years we're within $500,000 or $600,000, but when you get to 2020, there's over $3 million. Can you explain how there's such a spread there in that particular year? What did we do? Or
Yeah. So it was a concerted effort as this team felt the financial challenges at the end of 2019. So adding in, as we issued a taxable GO bond or general obligation bond at the end of 2020 that this team may remember, through the efforts of Mr. Ronk and Eric Long here on the call, we were able to issue a GO bond, which generated approximately $2 million that we were able to get into the operations fund just to help stabilize. As this team may remember, at the end of 2019, our reserves were pretty tight. And so as a result of that dwindling cash balance, as a way to generate income or revenue as soon as we could, we issued taxable general obligation bonds, which helped generate more dollars for the operations fund in the short term in 2020. So that helped on the operations side. But I think this team knows as well as anybody that there were a lot of things done at the district level to help manage some of the expenditures. I know Mr. Ron could probably name many more than I could, but there were some positions that were not refilled, at least immediately, and there were some purchases that were just pushed back to future years, and not buying as many buses. So there were a lot of things done at the district level to help manage those costs in 2020. Dan, do you want to mention or jump in? Because I know you can talk a lot more detail than I could about exactly what was done.
Well, we shared a lot of things. We stabilized our expenses on our bus maintenance. The preschool was a big turnaround in terms of going from such a big negative to actually a positive. So, and our personnel costs just simply went down with several new hires. So there were several trends in that area.
Brock, can I add 2 cents on the topic of that taxable GO bond as well?
Mm-hmm.
Just want to point out, we mentioned this to Mr. Ronk at the time, and I think it bears repeating that. So taking a step back, most of the time when a school corporation issues bonds, they're issued on a tax exempt basis. You're a political subdivision. The federal government has deemed it that you guys get to borrow on a tax advantage basis if you abide by certain rules and restrictions. And one of the typical rules and restrictions is that it has to be for a project that is forthcoming, and typically at the outset of one of the first things we do at a board level is approve a reimbursement resolution, and you can only go backwards 60 days from that reimbursement resolution to reimburse projects on a tax-exempt basis. What we did in 2020, what makes this different, the fact that we did a taxable GO bond, once you make it taxable and you're no longer borrowing on a tax-advantaged basis, the IRS doesn't care nearly as much on what you're reimbursing for, and more importantly, how far back you go. So what Mr. Ronk did was he got a laundry list of items that had been done at the school corporation over the past X number of years, 3-4 years, that could have been done through tax-exempt borrowing at the time. So things, and Mr. Ronk, you may have the list, but anything from paving to just any general improvements that were done that would have come out of CPF, then transformed out of titling to the operations fund. So that was a list that was compiled on things that we're going to reimburse on a taxable basis through a bond issue. And I say that just to highlight the fact that it was we kind of view it as kind of a one-time shot in the arm, if you will. And Delphi is one of a few clients that we've worked with, along with Brock and his team at Baker Tilly, on doing this kind of one-time infusion by going back and looking at reimbursing projects years in arrears to be able to reimburse on a taxable basis. So it's not something that's going to be typically available on an ongoing basis, but that's another reason why 2020 looks so dramatically different, was through that kind of one-time cash injection.
Yep, great point.
Brock, I'd make one comment. This comprehensive financial plan is based on enrollment, and it's been very positive for us, but it's also very scary in the sense that right now what the state is doing, as they look at taking students away from public schools, is a very, very dangerous trend for us and for every public school. So, we hope the funding is there, but it is very critical that we get them to back off of the money they're putting into the choice programs, so on, if public schools are going to have a chance of meeting this 5-year projection.
Yeah, I think just one last point on that is, as again, we're targeting that the district will generate $6,000 per pupil going forward. And while you hear from either via the media or legislators that there could be an increase in 2% in fiscal year 2022 and a 1% in fiscal year 2023 or vice versa, that does not factor into account that if the pool of dollars is opened up to a much broader standpoint of students across the state, there's just more competition. So there's certainly no guarantee that 2% and then 1% increases are actually going to occur. So I think the approach was the best one, and trying to be as conservative as possible with our projections, because really difficult to project that what any bill like the choice program could have on Delphi specifically right now.
Rock, you mentioned about our education fund being up 30% going forward. That's not 30% per year, but that's from where we was at our low to where we're kind of at now, right?
Yeah, so if you look at where we're projecting at the end of 2024, that we're projecting that the ending cash balance will be $3,068,000. Compare that to your revenue of $10.1 million, you can see that that's approximately 30% cash balance we're projecting at the end of 2024.
Yeah. Is that assumption that we are not supporting the operation fund, kind of like we've been doing out of the education, or that they become basically self-supporting, or is that still figuring that 15% that we've been doing into the operation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you can see as part of the projection from 2020 to 2021, the increase from about 8.6 million to about 9.7, almost 9.8 million. So that adds in the assumption that the education fund will transfer 15% to the operations fund, which is the target developed by the state of Indiana. So to answer your question more concisely, this does build in the assumption that education will fund a portion of the operations fund.
And then I had another question on the rainy day fund.
Uh-huh.
So what would it take? The projection is about a little under $600,000. If we as a board would sit there and say, we at one point when I first came on, it was like a little over $1 million. What would it take us to get back to that type of scenario, having $1 million or $1.5 million